For those of you who don't know me, I am Tim Nelms, and today I'm representing UKAAF, the UK Association of Accessible Formats. I also work for Crawford Technologies. We're a specialist in software technologies for transcribing into accessible formats. So delighted to be with you here today. And UKAAF indeed is with you here for the next 3 days. And we're hosting a series of lunch and learn sessions aimed at providing essential facts and information about accessible information standards. And we use that term advisedly because there are so many different ways of expressing information accessibly these days. So over the next 3 days, our subject area experts are going to be hosting sessions on topics including Braille, large print, audio, EPUB, PDF, Office documents, and music. And those sessions are designed to help people learn about really important standards for accessible information, actually see demonstrations of assistive technology, and hopefully understand something about the future of accessible information standards. Although more accurately, that's what we're going to be doing on the session here today. One other thing of note is we're hosting an introductory session which tells you about some of the social history behind accessible information, the types of disabilities that are affected by access to information, the standards that we at UKAAF curate for making information accessible. So that introductory session ran time today.
Well, on the previous screen.
And I think we just have somebody I need to mute, if you'll forgive me. Thank you. And that introductory session ran at lunchtime today. However, it will be available for viewing on the UKAAF and on the AbilityNet website. And I'd recommend it if you'd like plenty of background about the history behind accessible information standards. That session does rerun again at 1 o'clock on Thursday at the same time as we're hosting a panel session involving all of our subject matter experts. So the great thing about this panel session is I get to bring together some of the greatest minds in the industry. I say that very advisedly. I'll leave you to make your own judgment about that a little bit later once you've heard them speak. And they don't by any means represent all of the kind of types of accessible information that I described a moment ago, but they do represent some of the really important ones. So I'm delighted to welcome a representative from the Braille and the accessible music community, and from representatives for EPUB and PDF. And to that end, I'm delighted to welcome, first of all, Duff Johnson from Boston in Massachusetts. Welcome, Duff.
Very happy to be here.
Secondly, Richard Orme. I think you're based in the United Kingdom, Richard.
Yeah, I'm here in Royal Leamington Spa in Warwickshire, right in the centre.
Fantastic. And you'll be representing Daisy, I believe.
That's correct. Speaking for the Daisy Consortium, and I don't know if maybe we introduce our organisations in just a bit.
You will do. And finally, Roger Furman. Where are you based, Roger?
Near Herefordshire. Well,
Fantastic.
in Herefordshire, but near a few miles from Hereford.
Well, in that case, Richard and Roger, you can see each other for dinner tonight, I guess, because you're that close. Duff, you're the odd one out, being based over the other side of the pond. So
Painfully aware of it.
So before I ask the panelists to introduce themselves, I'm going to just set a few themes for today's session. And I guess they're somewhat ubiquitous because they revolve around, first of all, digital technologies, secondly, mobile, thirdly, multi-channel, and I suppose we'll describe that as we go along, and then finally, information ubiquity. So I suppose in the same way as the whole of the planet is going digital, in the same way, information is becoming digital, and all of the ways that people with impairments access information are changing as well, often moving on to digital types of devices. And that covers all kinds of information, including Braille, of course, which can be read through things like Braille displays. And at the same time, we're seeing differences in the way that people access information. Mobile devices are providing a great access to people who want information on the move, as well as in their homes, not just in offices. And we're seeing an explosion of new channels. You don't just receive information via the post, you receive it via your screens, via text, via audio maybe, and increasingly personalized. So you're seeing these services offered by a whole range of industries that include publishing, that include government, that include banking, financial services, utilities. Everybody's starting to switch on to the fact that there are lots of ways to make information available and accessible to people. And I suppose that brings us on to UKAAF, because at UKAAF we've made it our mission to ensure that, in quotes, all information is accessible to everyone, regardless of disability. So it's during this session today that I want to find out how we can put into practice this new world of accessible information. I want to find out what industries are leading the field, and importantly, what the future holds for accessible information. Now, during the sessions over the course of today, speakers have been asked to introduce them and give a brief visual description. And actually, I'm going to ask the participants here to give a detailed introduction to their organizations as well. So I'll begin with that. I did notice my colleague on the previous session described herself as a white middle-aged woman. So I thought I would take the opportunity to turn that around and call myself a vigorous, youthful 52-year-old white male in a gingham shirt with graying hair. So that'll just give you an indication. But Richard, I wonder if I could begin with you, because the Daisy Consortium I'm absolutely fascinated by. I know it has a great history along with the IDPF, if I'm right. Please tell us something about yourself and the organization, and take your time, because we'd love to hear more.
Well, I'll briefly describe myself before moving on to the more interesting topic of the organisation I'm representing. So I'm Richard Orme. I'm really pleased to be here at TechShare again. My first TechShare was in the year 2000, would you believe, in Sheffield, where we had one international speaker. So I'm sitting in my home study, as many of us are in this year, and I have a map of the world behind me. I'm sitting here in a Daisy branded t-shirt and sporting my COVID beard, as I believe it's supposed to be called. So I'm working for the Daisy Consortium, which is an international non-profit organization with headquarters in Zurich, but actually staff based in Canada, the US, in the UK, various countries in Europe, in India and in Kenya. And our mission is to make accessible information to people with disabilities, and our kind of founding instrument really is the United Nations Charter on the Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So we are a rights-based organization. We're not a campaigning organization, we bring technology solutions. We work in three main domains, supporting special libraries and service providers all around the world that provide accessible materials to people with disabilities. In many countries, there's a specialist library that creates books, magazines, newspapers, and other information materials in accessible formats, and increasingly, Tim, as you mentioned, in digital formats. We also extend the Daisy family, so we're particularly cognizant of the fact that in many countries around the world, these specialist services don't exist. So we also have projects and initiatives working in countries such as Burkina Faso, in Malawi, Nigeria, and Southeast Asia and so on, where we're supporting both government and non-governmental organizations to establish the principles of accessible reading and getting materials into the hands of persons with disabilities, in particular to ensure that they're able to engage in education and also in the cultural life of the countries in which they live. And then the third area is to work with the mainstream publishers who are creating those books and textbooks and other reading materials, because actually creating special versions of published materials is, wonderful work, but it can never keep up. And people should have access to information that when it's created accessibly, when it's born digitally, it is also born accessible. So that's a big piece of our work too, which I'm sure I'll speak about in a little bit.
Okay, well, so I'm going to run a little competition during these introductions. When was the principles upon which Daisy is based, when were they founded? When was this work started?
I would say the work started in the main just after the First World War, when many soldiers came back from the front in Canada, in the US, in the UK, and other countries, and one of the things that was started were talking book libraries for people with blindness, soldiers coming back because of war injuries and so on. So many of the Daisy libraries started their work around that kind of time.
Fascinating. Thank you, Richard. So moving on, the second person I introduce is Roger Furman. And Roger, you're representing UKAAF today. But that's not your only job, am I right?
You're quite right. It's one of my jobs. My other main job in life is running my business, which is concerned with producing Braille music, i.e. transcribing music from print into Braille. I do other things apart from music, but it is very, very much music based. I'm sitting in my office, surrounded by various pieces of Braille technology, and on the wall to my left there is quite a large, not accessible map, but there is a lovely map of Mars, and my office is full of other nice things too.
So Roger, tell us about UKAAF, because you've been involved in that for quite a while, I believe.
Well, I mean, UKAAF, the UK Association for Accessible Formats, UKAAF, was founded in 2009 by 3 organisations coming together, and I got involved in about 2012, 2013 with the music subject area. But UKAAF itself came together with these 3 organisations: the Confederation of Transcribed Information Services, the UK Association of Braille Producers, and the Braille Authority of the United Kingdom. And our vision is a world in which blind and partially sighted people and other print impaired individuals receive quality accessible formats which meet their reading needs. Our members include individuals and organisations with an interest in the provision of quality accessible formats, such as transcribers, service providers, educators, researchers, print services, publishers, and of course, our end users. Our membership categories comprise individuals, affiliate, sponsoring, and sustaining members. We work nationally and internationally on codes and standards for accessible formats, where our partnerships are of key importance, and Daisy is one of our partners. Currently, we are looking to extend our membership and develop further partnerships with like-minded organisations globally, and those where we have something to offer and where our work can reach a much wider audience. Tim, back to you.
Thanks for that, Roger. So I have my supplemental question, which is, when does Braille go back in terms of dates and history?
1829, Louis Braille. Well, he started working on it in 1824, and it grew out of previous systems that had been developed for passing codes by night in a tactile form to soldiers in the field. And his system, first one to make it possible for people not only to read, but to be able to write Braille. So he produced that in 1829 and then built onto that the foundations of the music code, which were established in, revised and came out in 1835. And it's largely that code that has remained until today. It's been altered slightly, but I think Louis Braille himself would be thrilled that we are now moving into more and more into digital. And as I say, he himself was a musician. He played the organ, and interestingly, there was a message that went round on the list of which I'm part of, that asking about Louis Braille. yesterday, so I was able to feed some information back. He also played the cello, so he was a fantastic person, and it would have been really, really interesting to have met him. But he came up with this system, and it's stood the test of time.
1829. Okay.
Yep.
Can we get any improvement on that? So I'm going to move next to Duff Johnson on our panel. Duff, introduce yourself.
Hi there, Tim. Yes, thank you. I'm Duff Johnson. I'm a white 51-year-old male with a beard, a dark blue shirt. I've got a PDF Association logo over my shoulder, or I should. That's a virtual logo, so I don't really know if it's there or not. And I'm seated in my office in Winchester, Massachusetts, just north of Boston, and that's where I'm coming to you from now. I've been involved in personally involved in the accessibility space since 2000, when I was a vendor back then, running a service bureau, and very heavily involved in enhancing PDF files to serve business needs. Along came tagged PDF, invented by Adobe, and I had a relationship with Adobe at the time. They used our service bureau to kind of test new ideas a little bit. And so we started to work on that, got some insight into it. And when the United States federal government passed the Section 508 regulations in June, I think it was June 6, 2001. I remember it very well, or at least the event, not so much the exact date, but it was in June. Because I was so naive that I sat by my phone and I thought, wow, this is going to be great. We're the only people in the world to do tag PDF. And that means the phone is just going to bounce off the hook because these new regulations have come out, and now everybody in the federal government has to do this. And time went by, and phone didn't ring for months. But in the meantime, we did eventually figure we got handy with tag PDF, and I got involved in the standardization of tag PDF very early on. I was actually started as the chair in 2004 of the AIM committee that started developing PDF UA, which then became the ISO 14289, the international standard for accessible PDF technology. And so, rightly or wrongly, that project started there. And it needed to get going because it turned out there were a growing number of vendors who wanted to deliver tagged PDF, which is to say accessible PDF, to end users and to the agencies and so on that wanted to deliver that. But there was a lot of difficulty in coming to common consensus. So one vendor would deliver something and call it good, and somebody else tested it or had a different opinion based upon some other software. And so there was a collision, angry customer, confused vendors. And so the whole principle of standardization of this technology emerged out of the frank need in the industry to say, look, we have to get our act together because it doesn't do anybody any good if we deliver something and you deliver something else and the customer doesn't know which one's right. Right. So we had to figure that out. So that's
Duff, I know, the PDF Association itself has somewhat broader interests. Accessibility is a part of what it does. Can you tell us just a little bit about the broad interests of your organization?
Sure. So the PDF Association started as, in fact, the PDF-A Competence Center. A in that case is for archiving, not accessibility. Started in 2006. It's a German-based organization. It's the international home of the PDF industry. So about 130 odd companies at the moment, a number of different consultants or members of the PDF Association. And its purpose is to develop and promote international standards for PDF technology. And that includes PDF itself. It also includes PDF-A for archiving, PDF-E for engineering, other specifications. PDF has many, many sectors in which it's deployed. It's extremely versatile, horizontal, vertical technology, goes in every direction you want. So it's vital in the print industry. It's vital in deliverables. It's vital for office documents. It's vital in the courts and the law and so forth. So the PDF Association has a variety of interests, and those interests include very strongly the accessibility interests. So in the PDF Association, it's been heavily involved in supporting PDF UA development and standards and other efforts connected with improving common understanding of tag PDF. The PDF Association donated to support NVDA development a long time ago, like 8-10 years ago. Published a document quite familiar to a lot of people in the space called the Matterhorn Protocol. It's a freely algorithm. Actually, it's a set of failure conditions that help people understand how to conform to PDF UA. We published the tagged PDF best practice guide for syntax, which provides 60-odd pages of additional information about how to go about using tagged PDF correctly to ensure you get conformance with PDF UA. And within the association right now, there are about 5 or 6 5 different individual technical committees, all of them which circle around the subject of tagged PDF. They're not all of them involved directly in accessibility, but for example, in the reuse committee there, what they're working on is directly tied very closely to accessibility, because reusable PDF also tends to be accessible PDF. So we have an enormous number of projects and volunteers and work going on, including thing I'm very excited about right now is the association is very busily developing a new set of PDF techniques, which should be fully comprehensive and dramatic expansion on the existing set of WCAG techniques. We intend to cover essentially all the common use cases, providing comprehensive pass and fail techniques for those. Okay. So the association is an industry organization. We have some government agencies that are also members that kind of observe what we're doing in this space. But we're here essentially to assist our members find a common understanding of tagged PDF and provide an interface with the user community.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Duff. And it's important to say, whilst we're being represented here by people who are knowledgeable experts and leaders of organizations in PDF, Daisy, Roger, if you like, I'm going to ask you to represent Braille here, but there are a wide range of other accessible information formats out there, most notably things like office document formats, audio, large print, accessible images. And I hope we can create a rounded discussion that includes all of those things today, despite our individual affiliations. So just to kick off the questions for today, I wanted to start off with you, Roger, first of all, because I want to look at, where we've been. Oh, and I did forget
supplementary.
Supplementary question, yes. When did your standards start to get developed?
I'm sorry?
When did your standard become developed? We're trying to get a timeline here. What date do you want to give me?
Okay, so PDF was invented in 1993. Tagged PDF first hit the market in 2000. PDF UA development started in 2004. It was published in 2012, revised in 2014, and PDF UA 2 will come out in probably a year and a half.
Okay. Well, it's a complicated answer, but it makes no difference, because I'm going to declare Braille the winner with a date in the early 18th century. I think it's the only one that I can pick. Thank you for that. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the options for consuming accessible information and how that's changed in the last 30 years. So Roger, I want to chart a little bit about the use of traditional accessible formats and how they're changing in the digital age. And if you can give us that perspective by looking at Braille, perhaps, but include other formats if you wish.
Sure. Okay, Tim. Well, in case it's of interest to our audience, I myself have read Braille from a young age, firstly learning literary Braille and then Braille music, in which I specialise. At this stage, it was mainly paper-based. When I acquired my first computer, it was a BBC Micro, do you remember those? To which I attached a speech synthesizer, Braille embosser, printer, and a teletext adapter, that accessing more information for myself became a reality. And about 30 years ago, the day came when I upgraded to my first PC, and around that time began receiving an electronic newspaper. Of course, the world has moved on very much since those days. So some people might be wondering, do I still use hardcopy Braille? The answer is yes, indeed. I think it's crucial that we do not forget those people, wherever they are in the world, for whom digital is just not a reality. Digital is absolutely key, and obtaining accessible information more and more, not as a something special, but just part of what happens. That's where we've got to get to, I suggest. And Richard's already referred to that in his area. We've just got to get there as this is not special, this is what happens. So, yes.
Thank you for that, Roger. I appreciate that little bit of background. I'm going to move on, and I wanted to put a question to Richard. And what do we think the key issues are for accessing information? By the way, there are some questions coming up in the chat window there. I would encourage people, if they want to type responses to that, Duff and Richard, if you wish, but I will read those out in a moment. So, Richard, you know, the key issues for accessible information, and I'm imagining here that, you know, there are issues around how we interpret particularly digital information. And could you tell me something about how those things are embodied in the EPUB standards?
Well, you know, you kind of tried to characterize this a little bit as kind of representing a standard, but I'm sure many of us actually are interested in accessible information, and certainly at Daisy, although we invented the Daisy standard, and in fact there's several of them, we work on the whole kind of agenda of access to information. So that's the Daisy standard, but we also work on accessible PDF and HTML and Office documents and so on. Just tying together with Roger's comments about the BBC Micro, which for folk outside of the UK may not know was a kind of early home computer and really successful. It was on the BBC Micro that I first encountered a blind student who was looking to study a certificate in agriculture at Warwickshire College of Agriculture. And by using that talking technology, he was enabled to be able to study and get access to the materials that his his peers in his class were using. And he actually was a keynote speaker in later years at a TechShare event. So there's a nice little arc for you. He became an executive in the telecoms industry from studying pig husbandry at Warwickshire College of Agriculture. But I claim no credit in that area. So kind of key issues, I think, transcend the formats, and I thought of three ones that were pretty important, and you might be interested to know they're not kind of technical specifics. They're around awareness and skills and tools, I think, are some critical ones. So awareness is an awareness amongst information producers that accessibility is important and it's something that they have some responsibility for. But also awareness in terms of consumers that actually information can be accessible to them, whether they're reading a book, studying on a course, engaging in social media, accessing the news, and so on, and that there are tools and techniques that will enable them to get access to that in a really rich and meaningful way. Skills, so that people who are producing information know that there are relatively simple things that they can do that really transform access for people with reading disabilities of sorts. So we're not just thinking people with blindness here, we're also talking about neurodiverse, people with low vision, people with physical disabilities. So I will encounter, for example, documents that come out of the education sector where people have produced a Word document, for example, and the headings are just bigger and bold. And images don't have any alt text, and a table is actually an image of a table. And they don't know that by adding some simple structure, they make it a better document for everyone, but also something that is much more navigable by a student who's using assistive technologies, using ways of being able to get around without using the mouse, and so on. But also skills for the end users, the users of accessible documents, that there are techniques they can use that mean that they're not kind of reading through a document as if it were a toilet roll, starting at the beginning and kind of going all the way through. There are powerful ways of using things like a table of contents, being able to jump between headings, navigate directly to a graphic or navigate within a table. The same kind of techniques that they can use on the web often, but actually the story we hear from folk who are in this space is often the end users don't actually know these skills. So there's something on the organizations working with people with disabilities, the schools and colleges supporting them, and for people with disabilities themselves to actually have the skills to make use of what's being developed. And lastly, tools that mean that it's easy for people to create accessible documents. Actually, it's difficult for them to create inaccessible documents. You mentioned Microsoft. I think they're doing good work in this space. And then the assistive technologies being able to support these sorts of features too.
So I love the expression there, the toilet roll, which I suppose is a synonym for, the scrolling interface, because I have a theory, Richard, which is, with the introduction of modern technology, we've actually gone back several, well, perhaps a couple of millennium even to where the scroll was the ubiquitous way of looking at information. We're using it again, of course, on our mobile devices, but that has all kinds of implications for how we access that information. I was very interested in what you had to say about structure and going through the structure of content. And I just want to pass that back over to Duff, because I guess that's a fundamental principle of, how the PDF standard evolved, because its principle really is started off with the page and how to structure information on the printed page. Could you kind of expand on that for us, Duff?
Yes, that's right. PDF very much started off as what in the industry you might call a page description format or language. The entirety of the purpose of PDF at its inception was to paint a picture that was precisely represented the author's intent on a physical page, and that the ability to transport that physical page between systems, over time, my computer, your computer, and it would all get the exact same result. That was the mission. Several years into PDF's development, it became obvious that there were a lot more things that people wanted to do with PDF, accessibility being one of those things. And that for that purpose, you would need to have the concepts of structure also be available in the PDF format, paragraphs and headings and lists and tables and so on. And that to be able to represent all that pretty picture that the PDF initially represented on the page, to be able to structure that pretty picture so that it could be exported, so that it could be saved out or processed by a tool that only wanted to look at the text, such as AT, for example.
So just to help answer one of the questions we had earlier from the audience was, about PDF's future. How does that relate to PDF's future then, in terms of, what does it have to offer the world, and why is it going to be relevant?
Well, the use case is that PDF is a general purpose document format. Okay, it's unlike, for example, a web page, which is more of an experiential. The PDF, you create an object that is self-contained, doesn't require any server support or any communications at all. You can deliver it to somebody else, and they open it up and they receive precisely the experience you intended. And PDF, because it's self-contained, includes a variety of features and capabilities that other formats don't have at all. So other formats don't really make it possible to, for example, combine elements of different documents into a single document very readily. They don't make it possible to annotate documents. You can't redact other formats besides PDF, for example, right? So PDF includes like various kinds of metadata. You can include third-party files within the structure and then refer to them. It has its own integrated navigation model. So PDF, it's an enormous format. It's everywhere because it is it's so completely capable of handling the general document function, right? Which sometimes that means you have to take page 3 from this contract and merge it into this contract over, the original draft of a contract and deliver that. If you had to live with it, that's something that paper can do, right? And so people demand a document, a digital document format that has equivalent capabilities to paper. Now, PDF, ironically, was invented to provide a digital version of paper, and then structure was added to it. The bad part is that structure wasn't built in from the beginning. The good part is that PDF remains capable of being the general purpose document format, and it also can be accessible.
So I'm interested just to hear a reflection from Roger here, because, well, one of the threads that I think connects what I've heard from Richard and Duff is the structure, it's the semantics, actually the meaning behind the information, regardless of the format that's important. How can you relate that back to Braille and how Braille presents to users?
I think before I get on to that, I think it's really important that I would like to make the point that we need to be very clear that it's important to recognize what many people out in the world are doing and have been doing. And it's important to remember that it's not only about accessibility that we need to be talking, it's also usability. And Richard has, I think, we've touched on this, but sometimes it sounds very obvious. You could have a web page that's accessible and completely unusable if it's not prepared properly. How do things come back to Braille? Well, Braille, I think we know digital is absolutely key in going forward, and there will be those who will still need and still use paper copy Braille, to which I alluded earlier, but with digital devices, searching is can be a bit limited, but I think as devices improve, this will improve more and more. And something I've been somewhat exercised or thinking about lately is how can one search, for instance, a score of Braille music in a meaningful way, rather than just doing a string search, which gets you a little way down the road, but not terribly far. So anyway, that's just something I'm thinking about at the moment. And Braille, of course, people can get a bit confused and thinking, well, Braille, is it still relevant? And I'd just say, well, Braille is literacy in its wide, and I'm talking about literacy in its wider sense. Of course, it's important. You'd never say to somebody who could learn print, well, I don't think you need to learn that today. Some people have said, oh, well, you can learn a piece of music by hearing it. You can get an idea of what it's like. It would be like saying, well, can you learn to spell all the words in English by listening to somebody speak them? I think we all know what the answer to that is. So the future is very much in Braille. It's going to be digital, and there are going to be lots of, I think, very interesting things down the road in time to come.
Thank you for that, Roger. Next up on my list, I want to talk about where accessibility is being used most from an industrial perspective. Which markets, which industries, if you like, see the most traction in adopting accessible information standards and best practice. And I know, Richard, you probably have a perspective on this. So I'd like to hear from you first, because I think, because of where you started, you've got a very particular driver for industrial driver, if you like, for some of the standards you curate.
Well, so as I mentioned before, the Daisy Consortium is made up of members who in the past have been basically operating as a separate kind of side parallel universe to the mainstream publishing industry. A book would be published in print, and then the specialist organizations would go about creating accessible versions of it. And this has always been a collaboration with the publishing industry. Authors have often recorded, even back in the early days. There are films on YouTube from Pathé News from 1945, I think, of authors recording onto gramophone the books that they produced. But what's interesting is how mainstream industries are now embracing accessibility themselves and implementing it as part of their business. And the industry, I think, for which that's most obvious to me is in the publishing industry, and especially in the education and academic publishing industry. The kind of leading charge on this is North America, in US and Canada. And just hearing Roger talk about usability as well as accessibility reminds me of some events that I've seen hosted there, which they call Publishers Face Off. And here we have academic publishers taking books off their production line and submitting them into a process for review by people with disabilities, accessibility experts, and folk who are kind of basically pulling those published materials apart and critiquing them. And what's very interesting is that not only are those publishers implementing the accessibility standards with proper structure, proper semantics. So, for example, the maths are included as proper math, not images of math. The table are proper images, proper tables, not images of tables. and they're including not only descriptions but extended descriptions. But one of their messages is test, 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 so that the end users not only have an accessible experience, but they have the very best experience if they're using an assistive technology. So very interesting to see that. So the publishing industry kind of building accessibility into their workflows so that it's basically that means that the specialist organizations can then concentrate on materials that aren't born accessible or serving the needs of folk who aren't served through the mainstream. So really interesting to see these events happening in the US. What will be exciting to see these kind of events happening in Europe and in the UK too, because there are actually UK publishers who are submitting titles to these things. And let's hold something like this in the UK and raise the awareness of British publishers and British companies who are really embracing accessibility and in quite a creative way. I just don't think we know about it enough in the UK.
Fascinating. So your nomination for top industry is publishing. I'll turn that same question over to Duff Johnson.
Please.
And Duff, Duff, I know you're responding to questions that are coming in, by the way. The question is, which industries are you seeing the most ready to adopt accessible information, particularly from your perspective with PDF? Are you seeing any industries where that's particularly the case?
Yeah, there are a couple leading industries. You know, government is particularly in the United States and Canada and Australia and some other places has the obvious mandate to serve their entire population with not only published documents but a wide variety of other content that the government develops and distributes through its normal course of business. So governments are huge in that. Another major sector delivering accessible documents and showing a great deal of interest in it is the financial services sector. Banks, mortgage companies, insurance companies, and similar organizations are increasingly involved. They're under the gun to deliver, you know, their bank statements and their drug benefit plans in an accessible form to their users for obvious reasons. And so we're seeing a tremendous amount. There are many different banks in the United States now where logging onto their website and accessing their statements, you're routinely offered the option of an accessible PDF.
So I'm going to return to that point in a moment, but I just want to return to Roger. I suppose you have, Roger, a unique perspective on an industry and how accessible the information is in that industry.
As I said earlier, I think there's some really good practice out there, but I think it's really important that we do recognize that I think that in this world there are many people and organizations who want to do more about accessibility, but it doesn't happen quickly enough, or we know that the takeouts can be, you know, very low. And you look at where we need to get to, and I think often that accessibility is way down the list rather than being included right from the start where it needs to be. And that's probably frustrating for them, but commercially it could be, well, you know, we've got to get these products out there because you know, of commercial reasons. But so I think it's a mixture. There's some very good stories to tell, but let's keep realistic as well and realize that we've got an awful long way to go to get near to completing what we want to do. And I'll just give you one example that I just hear year after year after year. There are people who need books in education who, you know, there's so much time, unnecessary time that shouldn't be spent on having to reformat certain particular files and, you know, get out what adaptations are needed for students. But the same things just come up time and time again, and we must break this circle somehow.
Okay, thank you for that, Roger. So returning to a little bit to our debate about what's happening in different industries, I just want to touch on geography. And I do get the sense, Duff, as representative of North America, if you don't mind, and Richard as representative of Europe, that there are different different, if I can't say paces of travel. You know, the US market does seem to be adopting this technology at a faster rate. My sense is that Europe is a little bit slower than that, but I'm happy to be disabused of that. I'll start with you, Richard. What do you think of the global adoption of these technologies?
So, you know, I'm speaking in general terms. When I talk about the amazing things I'm seeing from US publishers, this doesn't mean that every US publisher is doing this. I'm obviously kind of focusing on ones that that come and talk to us and come and talk to the conferences. So the Pearsons and the Wileys and the Macmillans and the Kogan Page in the case of the UK. But were we to talk to disability service officers in the US, they would tell us it's a mixed picture, and we're on a journey, truthfully, and that would be the same in Europe too. It's not that the Europe is kind of hanging behind and nothing's happening. It's a mixed bag. One thing that will drive it is the European Accessibility Act, which is coming down the tracks, and governments and specialist organisations and publishers are now really engaging on this issue, because from 2024, if you're selling ebooks or ebook players in Europe, they will need to be accessible. So lots of people are really warming up on this whole kind of topic. At the beginning of I can't remember if it was last week or this week. I think it was last week. For example, I was at the Nordic Inclusive Publishing Initiative conference, where there were loads of publishers and disability organisations all meeting together to talk about inclusive publishing within a Northern European context. And later on this week, at the Daisy Consortium meeting, we'll have 90 of us getting together, and we'll have a specific focus on European access to publishing. Not just academic publishing, but also on school textbooks and on access to leisure reading and so on. So it's actually a kind of a mix, and it's definitely heating up in terms of folk getting on board in accessibility within the mainstream within Europe.
Okay. So the PDF Association, you're a global organization, Duff. Do you see any differences in terms of take-up rates in different parts of the world?
You're quite right that the United States has some significant energy for this, but it's certainly not alone in that. Famously, Ontario with the AODA is got probably some of the most stringent public sector requirements for accessible content, and in fact their requirements extend, unlike in the US where the situation for private organizations is mixed. It really depends a lot upon what kind of business they're doing as to whether or not the ADA can requirements apply to them. Section 508 is only about the US federal government, for example. Each individual state government makes up its own mind, but Ontario's rules are very, very strict. Australia has been pushing the ball forward on this significantly. I think we do see a number of organizations, including government organizations in Europe, that have taken a very much of a best practice or a sort of standards-based approach to this problem and are making advances in that regard. As to whether or not I've seen it adopted, in the commercial space to the extent that I would consider to be, very encouraging, I would say, well, frankly, not yet. And that's not just true in Europe. That's also true in most of the world, quite frankly. It's I think as Richard and as Roger have said, this is a technology and a complex stew of issues. The technology is part of it. It's not even necessarily these days the big part of it. It's so much of the problem is that authors don't know what they're doing, and that the tools don't help the author to know what they're doing. And these are immense roadblocks that are very, very difficult for the industry to overcome, per se.
Okay, so we're getting towards the end of our time, possibly even getting past the end of our time, but I think this is a fascinating enough discussion to continue, and we really need to get to the big question. And so I'm going to ask each of you for your predictions for accessible technology in 10 years' time. And in addition, are there any new standards that people ought to be concerned about or worried about or thinking about? So it's time to predict the future. We're not going to hold you to any of this. but we will be recording this session. Remember that. So in 10 years' time, we could make you look very silly if you get any of this stuff wrong. So I'm going to direct that question, first of all, question number one to contestant number one, Roger Furman.
Thank you, Tim. Well, I won't get it wrong. I believe that artificial intelligence, deep learning and machine learning could be extremely significant during the next few years. Speech synthesis and applications will certainly go on improving. Whatever these, you know, I'm sure, as I say, there are going to be lots of improvements. But again, I do say we just all must be mindful that are we going to just widen the gap between those who have and those who don't have? So I think there's a dual strand going on there. Standards are going to develop, and that's what I think.
Okay. So Roger, I'm very glad that you've raised the AI and ML. We'll see whether we get any agreement with that over the course of the next couple of months. Duff, your predictions.
Sure. Well, you're quite right. I mean, we're already seeing AI emerging as a potent force in helping to drive accessible content or should we say make up for the lack of accessible content by applying AI-driven type solutions to learn and understand the content and then find ways to express it again. So I think we can easily predict that systems to analyze existing documents and do a really pretty good job of making them accessible will be pretty generic, at least for most typical types of documents, and frankly, even for very complex documents. We see a number of examples of that. We see some kinds of emerging software now, even on mobile viewers, which do an interesting job of automatically recognizing the content of a document, representing it. I think the more exciting thing for me, though, because it is not just making the machine smarter about understanding a document that itself is not trying to be understood, but is the improved automation and artificial intelligence applied to authoring systems. So once the authoring software is doing a better job of helping the user who's writing a document understand what they need to do, right? Oh, so I see you're trying to make a table here. Want me to help you with that, right? Or in many cases you add an image to Microsoft Word and it'll warn you it needs alternative text and so on. But will it help you write alternative text or quality control your alternative text? Will it evaluate that the way you did your table isn't particularly useful, or you broke your list, so it's not a contiguous list, or things like this? I would expect over the next 10 years that authoring software will provide the author, with more guidance on how to do the job right.
Fantastic. Thank you for that, Duff. And finally, Richard, your predictions for the future.
So aren't we excited by these new technologies and possibilities? But I'm going to talk a bit about not the leading edge, but the trailing edge, which is it takes time for technologies to be widely adopted and for people to be using them. So I predict that in 10 years' time, we'll still be working on folk who are beginning to take up some of the opportunities that are actually being developed right now, and we shouldn't lose sight of that. So I come across folk who have computers that are older, universities and businesses where they have a kind of approach that keeps things locked down and only moving slowly and evolving the software and so on. So I think we should pay attention to folk who are using older technologies, who maybe aren't at the kind of cutting edge, because we don't want those folk to be left behind. So that's my prediction, that we'll need to be paying attention to folk who are kind of maybe coming along in later stages, and that's valid because people have kind of different circumstances. So that's an important thing to remember, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely right.
Well, thank you, folks. We're hitting up against our time limit here, but that has been a very entertaining session. I hope everybody in the audience has found that valuable. Thank you for all of your questions. And I thank the panelists for trying to type away and get those answers as we've been going through. I hope everybody else has found that useful. There is a further session at 1 o'clock on Thursday, which involves the UKAAF subject area experts. which is a little bit more freeform than this, another opportunity to ask questions of what's happening with accessible information standards. But it just remains for me to say my very great thanks to Duff Johnson from the PDF Association, to Roger Foreman in the darkness now, it's definitely dark where you are, Roger, from UKAAF and from Golden Cord, and finally to Richard Orme from the Daisy Association. Thank you, all of you, for your very valuable contributions. There will be a recording of this session made available afterwards, and we thank you for joining us. Thank you very much.